At 11:47 p.m. on August 3, 1944, 17-year-old Sophie Scholl stood in the dimly lit corridor of Munich University's main building, her hands trembling as she scattered leaflets from the third-floor balcony. The papers floated down like snow into the atrium below, each one carrying words that could mean her execution. Fellow students, the German people stand before the final reckoning with the most abhorrent tyranny our nation has ever endured. Her brother Hans worked beside her in frantic silence, both aware that discovery meant certain death. They had already distributed thousands of these forbidden leaflets across Munich over the previous 18 months, calling for passive resistance, sabotage, and the overthrow of Adolf Hitler. But tonight's distribution was different, because tonight they were inside the heart of Nazi academic power, broadcasting their message of rebellion in the regime's own temple of indoctrination. The janitor would discover them in less than 3 minutes, and the Gestapo would arrive within the hour. Sophie knew the risks with crystal clarity because she had studied law long enough to understand that what she was doing constituted high treason under Nazi legal definitions, punishable by beheading under the guillotine at Stadelheim prison. Yet she continued scattering leaflets with methodical determination because she had concluded the silence in the face of genocide made her complicit in mass murder. This single act of defiance, executed by a teenage girl armed only with a mimeograph machine and moral courage, would transform her into the face of German resistance and force an entire nation to confront the uncomfortable question: if a university student could resist Hitler, why couldn't everyone else? Sophia Magdalena Scholl was born on May 9, 1921, in Forstenberg, a small town in southwestern Germany where her father served as mayor. She grew up in a moderately prosperous family that valued education, religious faith, and civic responsibility. Her father, Robert, was a liberal politician who despised the Nazis from their earliest days, refusing to display swastika flags and openly criticizing Hitler's rhetoric, even as it became dangerous to do so. Her mother, Magdalena, was a devout Lutheran who instilled in her children a strong sense of moral duty and personal conscience. Sophie had 5 siblings, including her brother Hans, who was 2 years older and shared her intellectual curiosity and moral seriousness. Unlike many German teenagers who enthusiastically embraced Nazi youth organizations, Sophie joined the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the female branch of the Hitler Youth, with skepticism that quickly hardened into disgust. She was initially attracted by the outdoor activities and camaraderie, but became disillusioned when the organization's ideological indoctrination intensified and its anti-Semitic content became impossible to ignore. By age 16, she had become quietly but firmly opposed to Nazism, influenced by her father's criticisms, her religious convictions, and her own observations of how Nazi policies were destroying German society. She excelled academically and enrolled at the University of Munich in May 1942 to study biology and philosophy, intending to become a kindergarten teacher. Her brother Hans was already studying medicine there, while also serving periodic military duty on the Eastern Front. It was Hans who introduced her to the small circle of students and professors who would become the White Rose Resistance Group, a name chosen to symbolize purity and innocence in opposition to Nazi brutality. The White Rose Group formed in response to escalating Nazi atrocities that could no longer be rationalized or ignored by educated Germans who had access to information beyond official propaganda. Hans Scholl and his friends, including fellow medical students Alexander Schmorell, Willy Graf, and Christoph Probst, had served on the Eastern Front and witnessed Wehrmacht atrocities firsthand. They had seen mass executions of Jews, the systematic starvation of Soviet prisoners of war, and the casual brutality with which German forces treated civilian populations. They returned to Munich in 1942 deeply traumatized and morally outraged, no longer able to maintain the psychological distance that allowed most Germans to ignore genocide happening in their name. Their mentor, Professor Kurt Huber, provided philosophical and historical frameworks for understanding Nazi tyranny, connecting current events to larger patterns of totalitarianism and moral collapse. The group began meeting secretly to discuss philosophy, theology, and politics. Reading banned authors like Thomas Mann and Stefan Zweig, listening to illegal BBC radio broadcasts, and debating how individual Germans could resist a totalitarian system that had eliminated all formal opposition. They watched as Jewish neighbors disappeared, as dissidents were arrested and never seen again, as the regime's grip tightened through intimidation and surveillance. The problem they confronted was both practical and philosophical. How could a handful of university students resist a regime that controlled every institution, monitored every communication, and responded to opposition with immediate lethal force? Armed resistance was impossible because they had no weapons, no military training, and no organizational support. Violent sabotage would provoke mass reprisals against innocent civilians. The only weapon available to them was words, the dissemination of information and ideas that could break through propaganda and force ordinary Germans to confront moral reality. They decided to produce and distribute leaflets calling for passive resistance, industrial sabotage, and preparation for Germany's inevitable defeat and the moral reckoning that would follow. The White Rose never sought official approval because they understood that any resistance activity was punishable by death under Nazi law. But they did attempt to gauge whether their message might resonate with authority figures who privately opposed Hitler but publicly conformed. Professor Kurt Huber, their faculty mentor, initially refused to participate in leaflet production despite agreeing with their message. He argued that resistance was futile because the Nazi surveillance state made sustained opposition impossible, that students would be caught and executed, and that their sacrifice would achieve nothing, because most Germans either supported Hitler or were too intimidated to act. He pointed out that previous resistance attempts by military officers, communist organizers, and church leaders had all been crushed with brutal efficiency. The Gestapo had infiltrated every significant opposition group, and even private conversation amongst Feminin carried the risk of denunciation. Huber believed the proper role for intellectuals was to preserve knowledge and moral clarity through the Nazi period, maintaining scholarly integrity while avoiding direct confrontation that would result in pointless martyrdom. The students listened to his arguments respectfully but rejected his conclusions. Sophie argued that silence in the face of systematic murder made intellectuals complicit in genocide. That preserving moral clarity meant nothing if it wasn't acted upon. And that future generations would judge Germans not by their private doubts, but by their public actions. She and Hans insisted that even futile resistance had value because it demonstrated that opposition was possible, that not all Germans had surrendered their conscience to totalitarian authority. Professor Huber eventually joined their efforts despite his reservations, unable to maintain his stance of principled inaction when students were willing to risk everything. Producing and distributing resistance leaflets in Nazi Germany required elaborate preparation and security measures that would have seemed paranoid in any normal society, but were absolutely necessary under totalitarian surveillance. The White Rose members purchased a used mimeograph machine through intermediaries to avoid direct connection to the equipment. They acquired paper in small quantities from multiple suppliers across different cities to prevent anyone noticing unusual bulk purchases. They obtained stamps and envelopes through similar distributed procurement methods. Sophie and Hans wrote the leaflet texts collaboratively, drawing on philosophy, theology, and contemporary political analysis. They wrote in deliberately elevated language, targeting educated readers who might be receptive to moral and intellectual arguments rather than emotional appeals. Each leaflet went through multiple drafts as the group debated phrasing, tone, and content. They printed late at night in Sophie's apartment or in other safe locations, taking turns operating the mimeograph while others kept watch for unexpected visitors or police patrols. The mechanical noise of the machine seemed deafening in the silent night, and they lived in constant fear that neighbors would hear and report them. The smell of mimeographing permeated their clothes and apartments, a scent they grew to associate with terror and exhilaration. Distribution required even more elaborate planning. They mailed leaflets to addresses selected from phone directories, targeting professionals. The Gestapo investigation was swift and brutal, designed to extract maximum information before executing the conspirators. Interrogators used psychological pressure, sleep deprivation, and threats against family members to break Sophie and Hans. They were held in separate cells and told that the other had confessed everything, a lie designed to encourage mutual betrayal. Neither sibling broke under this pressure. The Gestapo recovered the mimeograph machine, analyzed the leaflet content, and traced paper purchases and mailing patterns. They identified most White Rose members within 72 hours through document analysis and surveillance of known associates. Christoph Probst was arrested when interrogators found a draft leaflet in Hans's apartment. Alexander Schmorell and Willy Graf were arrested days later. Professor Kurt Huber was identified through writing style analysis that matched his philosophical language to passages in the leaflets. The speed and efficiency of the investigation demonstrated both the Gestapo's institutional competence and the nearly impossible challenge of sustained resistance in a totalitarian surveillance state. What shocked investigators was not the resistance network's sophistication, which was minimal, but the participants' absolute moral conviction. These were not hardened revolutionaries or professional conspirators. They were middle-class university students and a respected professor who had concluded that moral duty required active resistance even when that resistance was certain to fail. The interrogators tried to understand this mindset because it contradicted their assumptions about human nature and political loyalty. They expected resistance from communists, career criminals, or marginalized populations with nothing to lose. They didn't expect it from privileged students who had every reason to conform and prosper under the Nazi system. The White Rose leaflets achieved limited distribution during the group's active period, but gained enormous symbolic impact after their creator's execution. Before their arrest, the group had distributed approximately 15,000 leaflets across multiple German cities through mail and hand delivery. The sixth leaflet, the one that led to their capture, reached several thousand readers before the Gestapo could confiscate all copies. Individual leaflets were passed hand to hand, read by small groups, and discussed in whispered conversations among students and professionals who opposed the regime but had lacked any framework for expressing that opposition. The leaflet proved that resistance was possible, that not all Germans had capitulated to Nazi authority, and that moral opposition could be articulated clearly and publicly despite totalitarian repression. After Sophie and Hans were executed, copies of their leaflets were smuggled out of Germany through resistance networks and reached Allied intelligence services. The British Royal Air Force reprinted the final White Rose leaflet as a propaganda pamphlet and dropped millions of copies over Germany in summer 1943, retitling it The Manifesto of the Students of Munich. This mass distribution achieved what the White Rose could never accomplish themselves, reaching millions of German readers with a message of resistance written by Germans themselves rather than enemy propaganda. The psychological impact was significant because it demonstrated internal German opposition to Hitler, undermining Nazi claims of national unity. Across occupied Europe, resistance movements cited the White Rose as proof that even Germans were resisting fascism, boosting morale among fighters who sometimes viewed all Germans as irredeemable Nazis. The executions transformed Sophie, Hans, and their comrades from minor irritants into martyrs, whose moral clarity stood in devastating contrast to the regime's brutality. German civilians who learned of the executions were forced to confront the fact that the regime was beheading university students for distributing leaflets, an action that revealed totalitarianism's essential fragility and moral bankruptcy. The Nazi regime never officially acknowledged the White Rose resistance beyond announcing the executions, but internal documents reveal significant concern about the group's impact on civilian morale and military loyalty. Gestapo reports from 1943 noted increased instances of defeatist talk, anti-regime graffiti, and minor sabotage in Munich and other cities where White Rose leaflets had circulated. Nazi officials debated whether to publicize the executions as a deterrent or suppress information to prevent creating martyrs. They ultimately chose a middle path, announcing the sentences in official publications but providing minimal details and forbidding press coverage that might humanize the condemned. This strategy backfired because rumors and whispered accounts spread more effectively than official announcements, and the regime's obvious nervousness about student resistance amplified the white rose's symbolic importance. Military commanders expressed private concerns that executing students for anti-war leaflets might demoralize troops already suffering catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front. Some Nazi officials argued for clemency precisely because execution would transform minor dissidents into significant martyrs. But Hitler personally insisted on maximum penalties to demonstrate that opposition would not be tolerated regardless of perpetrators' age, class, or motivation. The regime's decision to proceed with executions, despite these tactical concerns, revealed totalitarianism's fundamental inflexibility. It could not distinguish between significant threats and minor irritants, could not calibrate responses proportionally, and could not tolerate any dissent regardless of strategic cost. This inflexibility was both the source of Nazi power and the seed of its eventual collapse. Sophie Scholl's execution on February 22, 1943, at age 21, transformed her into the enduring symbol of German resistance to Hitler. She was beheaded by guillotine at Stadelheim prison, alongside her brother Hans and Christoph Probst, dying with composure that witnesses described as extraordinary. Her final words, reported by the prison chaplain, were, "Such a fine sunny day, and I have to go. But what does my death matter if through us thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?" The courage she displayed during interrogation, trial, and execution created a moral standard against which post-war Germans measured themselves and found themselves wanting.